So if you've been following along on Risky Business, our 1985 Porsche 928S project car that's behind me and above on the rack, you saw how I put the new engine mounts in with Volvo units from 928s R Us. The cross member's back in, so now the next biggest component is to put the steering rack in. Before I do that, I've got to replace the bushings with a set of these from 928s R Us, and I'll show you what it takes to put this rack back in. Stay tuned. My goal this week was to reinstall all of the pieces of the 928 that I needed to remove in order to gain access to the oil pan gasket and the engine mounts. The three primary pieces that were left were the steering rack, the sway bar, and the starter motor. This video I'll take you through what I had to do to reinstall everything and some of the new components I added along the way. So while I had the steering rack out, I bought new Delrin bushings from 928s R Us. Some of the things I read online is that it helps improve steering feel and makes it a little bit stiffer for the rack to be mounted against the crossmember frame. But in order to install those new Delrin bushings, I had to remove the original ones. The original ones rely on a press-fit steel cylinder that forms a flange on either side of the aluminum mount of the rack, and then the bushing itself fits inside that. So in order to remove it, I had to use a cold chisel to tap those flanges, at least one side of those flanges, bend them up so that they would clear through the hole, and then I used a combination of a 1/4 inch socket extension and a socket that's about the size of the bushings themselves. Use those two pieces in combination with my tie rod extractor to pull these out. So there's a speed up of me tapping the flange. All right, and here's a top shot of me using the sockets I just described. Here's a close-up using the socket extension and pushing, and the tie rod extractor pushes down the bushing, and then the second socket finally pushes the bushing through. Now I can tap away the flange of that steel insert, and once I get that bent sufficiently, boom, it just pops out with my punch. Now here are the Delrin bushings going in. Again, I use my tie rod extractor to put those in because they are a press fit, and I do not have a hydraulic punch, so I use this as best I could. Soft blow hammer, put this in. So with the bushings in place, my next challenge was to put the steering rack up back into the cross member by myself. So not having a second set of hands to help me with this, I had to rely on my pole jack once again and some bungee cords so that it could hold it in place until I could get the steering rack at least held in place. So here I am putting the bungee cords in and the rack on the pole jack, holding him with the bungee cords, trying to loosely get it in place, and just use the pole jack once again, get it closer up. What I was doing here is trying to, the Delrin bushings were, when I went to put the original bolts in, were very tight. The bolts would not fit straight through. So I thought maybe I could they would self-tap in, but these are machine threaded screws, so that was a monumental waste of time what I'm going through here. What I ended up doing, and I don't show it, is I used a drill bit that was the same size as, I believe those are M6 bolts, but just enough to ream the bushings out just a little bit that they would fit through, and I could tap them with a soft blow hammer to get them through and thread them. Otherwise, you're just fighting them and trying to get the things through, because those Delrin bushings are very tight if you use them. I'm sure the feel is going to be a lot better in the steering, but I certainly hope the install was worth the effort. So this is just a sequence of me trying to get the bolts through. Eventually they did. I found that the bolts going up through as opposed to down worked better. But it was just a lot of time wasted here if I had thought to ream those Delrin bushings out just ever so slightly before going through this effort. The one thing you may notice on the left side is oil on the oil pan. I'm pleased to report that's not from the oil pan gasket. I have not put oil in the car as of this point. That is actually coming from the front power steering pulley, and we're going to talk about that later. But for now, just know that that's not from the oil pan gasket, because now that I have the rack in place, it's actually being held up by the bolts partially through the bushings that I just installed on the rack. The next up is I need to put in the support plate. Again, since I'm working by myself, I'm using the pole jack for that. So here I'm putting it into place, and there it's just, now I can put in the smaller bolts that hold the plate in place. There's 4 smaller ones of that. Finger tight those. Once I had that, I could move the pole jack out of the way and proceed to put everything back in place. You're doing yourself a disservice if you don't ream those Delrin bushings first. You'll be fighting them every step of the way. Now that the steering rack is loosely mounted into place, I needed to get the steering linkage in. This is probably one of the tougher jobs. So first thing, I had the starter wiring. I need to put that back in place. You see me putting the bracket there. I just loosely mounted that so that the wiring was out of the way. And here I am putting the universal joint. I'm using a soft blow hammer to press it back onto the steering rack. And then to the right side there is the steering box connection. This is a tricky job, and the gap needs to be just right. All right, important point here. If you take the rack out, and as I did, moved it back and forth, turning it to purge some of the fluid out of it when I was putting the new seals on and putting them on, theoretically the rack would be out of alignment with the steering wheel. The good news is the car never moved out of position. The wheels never were really out of position. So when I put the rack back in, before I did this step, I actually had to move the rack back and forth to get the tie rods to mount to the their knuckle on either side of the wheel. So I think from an alignment standpoint, I'm okay. I'm not too concerned because my next big project, on top of having to get a front end alignment for this, very soon I'm going to be taking out the dash pod, and that requires the removal of the steering wheel. So even if it's slightly off for now, I'll be able to take care of that later. Not once I do that. So don't flame me in the comments for that. I'm aware of what's going to have to happen. It's a matter of using a soft blow hammer and a pry bar to kind of. Here I am. Actually, this is in reverse order. I'm moving the steering rack to get the, as I mentioned, the tie rods in place, and then it flows up through. I just am doing these loosely because when I get the car all back together and running again, I'm going to take the wheels off and torque these properly because they feel like they're spinning right now, and it's not a critical thing for me to get done right this minute. Now I'm mounting the starter, and that's the 2 cap screws that you rely on an 8mm Allen wrench. So I have these T Allen wrenches that put that into place. That's pretty straightforward. If you were to see the before and after shots, this is quite a bit cleaner than it was. And now with that tightened, in my setup there's 3 wires. They're the black and the red, and those go on the big terminal. I think it's number 30, and then the smaller one goes on the side. I thought I was incorrectly putting it on the middle, but luckily I had video from an earlier one that reminded me that it goes on the lower. Here I am mounting the 3rd wire on the lower terminal of the starter solenoid. Okay, so in this shot, you see the wiring is reinstalled in the starter. And where the black lead curves around, it's mated to the red lead, you'll see that shiny spot there right on the curve. That's actually the outer sheath has been worn away somehow. So in the next shot, before I moved any further, I just simply used some electrical tape to cover that up and protect it a little bit more. I will, as a follow-up item, once I know if the starter's working properly and the engine starts, I'll come back and use some zip ties to fasten all three wires close together, as well as against the steering rack frame there. The important thing is to keep them out of the way of the sway bar, as that moves while the car's turning, and you don't want those wires obviously abrading against that. Of course, I couldn't let things go. I said, since the sway bar's out, I'll put new bushings in. So I ordered a pair of those from 928s or us, and they were an OEM replacement. So the first step is to remove the old ones. So I used WD-40 and steam to heat up the old ones, to basically loosen them up and get the old ones off, and then use WD-40 again to get the new ones on, and it was a bit of a fight. So here I am, a little WD-40 and some good old-fashioned elbow grease. The old ones came off relatively easily. Now, I did the same thing. There's me putting a new one on and forcing its way up. Now, you see this? So that's the one side. That's the driver's side, actually. It's the thing's flipped around. And they do work their way off. Wipe it down again. And taking the new one out of the packet, putting it in. You've got to work it around that curve. This one was more of a fight for whatever reason. I'll save you the swearing that was involved. Then I relied on steam to heat the bushing up. A little bit more WD-40. And there, it slid back on. All right, what you're about to see now is I have the sway bar in place, being held by, right by where my red light is. There is the sway bar drag link. I have them holding it up on either side. And now it's a matter of putting in the pillow blocks to hold the rest of the sway bar. All right. So what I did there is, you don't see it, but on the back side, it was easier to put in the backside screw of each pillow block. And then, since, as you can imagine, the angle of the pillow block is being forced down by the bolt being in, I used a pair of channel locks to put it back up into place, and that allowed me to put the forward bolt in, and here I am just tightening up. And the procedure's the same on the other side. So that's what kept me busy in the garage this past week. So you notice I didn't torque anything yet. As I torque things down, I mark them with a white paint pen. I did not do that here. My main goal was to just get the steering rack in place, make sure everything's okay, because if I need to make any other adjustments, I can do that and not waste time having torqued everything down. The only components that are not reinstalled right now are a new oil filter and the oil pressure sending unit. On the advice of one of the commenters on an earlier video, I did order a set of oil cooler lines. My particular 928 has an oil cooler on it, and those lines may be suspect in terms of leaking oil. So with all the work I've done to get the oil pan gasket changed, now is the time to change those lines, because they are very dirty with oil. I don't know if they're the cause or if it's going to be the power steering pump. I think it's just a combination of things. So next week, my focus is on changing the oil cooler lines, as well as pulling down the power steering pump, putting a rebuild kit in that, and changing out some of the banjo nuts on the various power steering lines. If all of that goes well, I will have taken care of all of the oil leaks on the engine, save for one, and that's the valve cover gasket on the driver's side. But suffice it to say, that's a small leak compared to all these other things going on. I want to make sure the power steering is no longer leaking, and I can fill the system and it holds pressure. that combined with the oil lines and a rebuilt power steering unit should do a lot to keep leaks from occurring again on this car for the foreseeable future. So that's this week's recap. Thanks for watching. I hope you found it informative. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button. If you haven't done so already, please press subscribe. I'm trying to keep to a 1-week cadence on the activities on the car. Appreciate you watching. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.